In a couple of minutes we'll move on to the next stage of our time together, which is the talk on James Dilworth. So there's still some plates to be picked up, so I'll give a couple more minutes for that. Then I'll introduce our guest speaker. Have your attention, please. We'll come to the keynote speech of the afternoon. Friends, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Emeritus Professor Russell Stone, ONZM. Professor Stone is an expert on the history of Auckland, about which he has written some 9 books. He's a local lad born in Mount Eden in 1923, an old boy of Mount Albert Grammar, and a graduate of Auckland University College, now the University of Auckland. After graduating in 1949 with an MA with first class honours, Stone worked as a secondary school teacher before coming back to university as a staff member in 1964 and completing a PhD in 1969 with Professor Keith Sinclair as his supervisor for that thesis. And the thesis was Auckland Business and Businessmen in the 1880s. So he continued to write in the area of Auckland's business history, which is something that made him an excellent candidate for writing a history on James Dilworth, a parishioner of St Mark's from its beginning, and definitely a man of business. It was the Dilworth Trust that commissioned Stone to write a history of James Dilworth in the early 1990s. It was no mean feat, given that the Dilworths were quite private people, but from his deep knowledge of the Auckland context in which James lived, and further study of his own in Ireland, Stone put together a very readable, informative and insightful book on James Dilworth that gives a fascinating window into the man and his times. And today's talk continues in that vein. So would you join me now in welcoming Professor Stone.
first Pākehā settlers scrambled to buy up the land that lies between Newmarket and Mount Hobson and bit beyond and One Tree Hill. But by 1860, 20 years after the founding of Auckland, two men dominated landholding. They were neighbours. One was Dr. John Logan Campbell, the other James Dilworth. Both were Anglicans. Dilworth seriously so, but Logan Campbell was a nominal Anglican, rarely attending services. And on one occasion, the local vicar gently rebuked him, saying that he rarely attended services, and John Logan Campbell replied, "I may not be a good attender, but I'm a good payer." Campbell was the most famous of Aucklanders, called the father of Auckland. He wrote a book, Poenama, a memoir that tells us why. He was on Tamaki before settlement, Pākehā settlement, even began here. And the press told his life story over and over again, particularly after he'd given his One Tree Hill farm as Cornwall Park to the people of Auckland. In contrast, Dilworth was little known then and now. A book on early Auckland spoke of him as a strange, self-centered man, and something of a recluse with farming as his only interest. Largely untrue, not true at all. We can understand how this came about, however, if we consider that he and his wife Isabella had no children on whom to pass family law that posterity could learn from. Fortunately, we can overcome this misconception, because if we look at Dilworth's life in Ireland, his background in Ireland, and his relationship with his wider family, which is well documented, I think it'll be convenient now if I give you a potted biography of Campbell. He left Ulster, which is in Northern Ireland, at the age of 24 and settled in Auckland in he was 24 and he settled in Auckland in 1841 to work in New Zealand's first bank, which was in Princes Street, just a muddy track then, however. 4 years later, however, he'd established himself as a landowner. He bought land on the North Shore and in Parnell, and more importantly, in Epsom. And he continued to invest in property, both in country and in town, for the rest of his life. When he died in 1894, at the age of 79, he was worth £150,000, which was an enormous sum of money at that time. And with this inheritance, he endowed the Dilworth Ulster Institute Trust, that is Dilworth School, today easily the wealthiest educational trust in New Zealand. Yet, what are we going to make of this reputation of his as a recluse, preoccupied with farming, with no interest in public affairs. This, as I've said, is palpably untrue. For instance, he was a member of the small group of settlers who got together and decided to form the Auckland Savings Bank for the labouring classes of Auckland, not the Auckland Savings Bank of today, I'm afraid, but the idea to encourage thrift amongst the workers. He was also a promoter of Auckland's first agricultural and pastoral society, and continued to serve on its executive committee for about 20 years. And it was through this A&P society that he probably met his wife to be, Isabella, because she was the sister of 4 members of the society who, like Dilworth, were Irish people with a farming background. Well, he married Isabella Hall. She, 24, he, 38. Whether it was a love match, I've no idea at all. No idea. But it was a marriage of true minds in the sense that she was a very intelligent, formidable lady. And the wider family called her Aunt Dilworth, whereas none of us, Auntie Dill Isabella, to the rest of the family. She was to be respected. But back to Dilworth's public activities. He served in the Auckland Provincial Council for several years, on the Auckland University College Council, and on the Diocesan Trust Council, and of many other C of E committees of that time. He was a typical Ulster Anglican, abhorred what he called the popish practices of having a chorus on the altar, or colourful raiments with vestments donned by ministers during the church season. Didn't approve of that at all. But this prejudice arose, I think, not through any religious conviction, rather than the need of Ulster Anglicans to differentiate themselves from the Roman Catholic Church in his homeland. And Dilworth himself held no sectarian prejudices. He employed Catholics on his farms, and particularly if they were Irish Catholics, all the better. Dilworth's Irishness came out in a number of other ways. I'm sure that, like most people who came from Northern Ireland, he had an ineradicable Irish accent. Have any of you seen the film Belfast? It's a lovely film, on recently. And you'll know what I'm getting at when I speak about the Ulster accent. When I was researching Dilworth's life about 30 years ago, I visited Northern Ireland, and I was astonished to notice the number of things, practices, farming practices, for instance, that were peculiar to Dilworth, sort of funnyosities, I imagine, that were actually quite standard in Northern Ireland. He'd taken them wholest bowls from the County Tyrone, where his birthplace was. Give you an instance. Like Bishop Selwyn, who surrounded the original St. John's College up the road, surrounded it with hawthorn hedges, and they were still around in Remnants about 50 years ago. He surrounded his farm in here, this area here, with hawthorn hedges. And as they as I went through Northern Ireland, I saw these hawthorn hedges everywhere, clumpish, not well developed as they are in Auckland's temperate, moist climate, where they flourish profusely. And Dilworth's hawthorn hedge bloomed a treat during the spring. And there's a story told of a shepherd tending his flock on One Tree Hill, breathing in the scented air that wafted up from the white hawthorn hedge surrounding Dilworth's home farm. Well, after 20 years in New Zealand, Dilworth had become a wealthy landowner, made possible, I suppose, because in the early years he had money in his pocket when he came to New Zealand, money from his own family. And why this came about, you've got to go back to his early life in County Tyrone, where at the age of 8, he was handed over by his parents to their auntie, his auntie, to be brought up as a kind of a family champion, somebody who was going to guard the family interest, just like the practice of entail, some of you might know about. And after 20, that's why in 1838 his aunt Dilworth sent him out to New Zealand in an attempt to repair the Dilworth family fortunes. And as I've said to you, after 20 years, Dilworth had well and truly established himself. And the time had come to act on behalf of the family back in Ireland and to invite them to come out. And the first to respond was Andrew, 8 years his junior, who arrived in Auckland in 1859 by way of America, where he picked up a wife on the way out. Dilworth gave to this brother 1,000 acres in the Waitakere Ranges, and if you want to locate it, you go up from Kumeu on the way to Bethel's Beach, and there was the farm that Dilworth gave to his brother Andrew. And Andrew made a go of things, fattening sheep and cattle, and sold meat and vegetables to locals like mill workers and kauri gum diggers, and also sold stuff in town here. He became a popular and public-spirited Westie until a frightful accident cut short his life in 1881. But it had never been James Dilworth's intention to make this brother Andrew his successor to the Epsom farm at the back here. Instead, he decided to skip a generation and invite the son of his sister, Eleanor, to come out. He persuaded Eleanor, now living in Canada, to give up her son Jimmy for the role of acting on behalf of his family, just as his parents had given him up to Aunt Anne for the family's sake. And in February 1863, Jimmy, that is James, little James, wee James Dilworth, they would have called him. In 1863, this 8-year-old boy came to Auckland, and he lived on the farm with James Dilworth and Isabella for 10 years, till he'd grown up into, they say, a handsome 6-foot young man. But suddenly he cleared out, presumably having no desire to hang around and wait to inherit a fortune and fill a dead man's shoes. And James Dilworth pleaded with this nephew to come back but he wasn't. Ironically, later on, a younger son of Eleanor, another nephew, developed, his name was Harry Mossman, developed Dilworth's skill as a farmer and as a businessman. You might say a successful successor to Dilworth at last. But unfortunately, it was then too late. His uncle had remade his will so that the future Dilworth School would inherit his fortune. And how did this come about? In the 1880s, Auckland suffered severe depression, much worse than the depression we suffered in the 1980s. And it brought the business community to its knees. Dilworth himself lost £40,000 by investing in companies and taking out mortgages to buy land that became unsaleable. But he survived, as did John Logan Campbell, for the same reason. For he followed the rule of good business, that you don't take out loans unless you have a core business that will generate an income that will enable you to pay the interest. You know what I'm getting at? Yeah. And the core business in his case was actually his excellent farm and his city properties, which included properties in town like Dilworth Buildings, you might remember them, Dilworth Buildings and the Thames Hotel, both at the foot of Queen Street. His biggest financial worry, however, had been in a land company incorporated in London to develop a huge property near Tingrow in Waikato. But this venture collapsed, not because of any incompetence of the directors or the farmers, but because the land was deficient in the trace element of cobalt, and it became bush-sick land, and the cattle and the sheep died. This is the only solvent member of the 9-man lending or selling syndicate in Auckland that had been behind this enterprise. Dilworth felt that he had to go to London to salvage something from the wreckage. And when he failed to save the venture. But what's important is, on the way home, 15 months later, he made friends with a young Church of Ireland minister known as George McMurray, who was going out to a parish in Victoria, Australia. And they hit it off straight away, being low church Anglicans. They hit it off straight away, despite the 40-year gap in ages. And with Auckland in the depth of the depression, Dilworth discussed with this young minister, what can I do? How can I use my wealth to give disadvantaged young people a chance in life? And 4 years later, Dilworth persuaded McMurray to apply successfully to a Cure of Souls, a parish in Auckland. And together again, these two men began maturing the idea of establishing in Auckland the equivalent of Christ's Hospital for Boys that was working in London. And so by the time of Dilworth's death in 1894, the idea of Dilworth School was well and truly formed. As the trustee advising on school uniform, Isabella and her penned-up maternal instincts were unleashed at last. She had the first wee boys dressed up like little Lord, for that's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Stone, and he's kindly offered to answer questions. We'll just have a short question time, so if you'd like to put your hand up, I'll bring the mic across and you can ask your question from all this expertise.
When was the exact date that the Dilworth School first began? Do you know? Was it before James's death or after?
I think it was about 1906.
Right.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about Dilworth School originally was it was envisaged as a primary school, and they had the idea of boarding boys as young as 6, 7, and 8, of having them as boarders there, both from Northern Ireland and in Auckland. But they didn't realise at that time how vital was it to keep young people with their parents until those formative years, pre-pubescent years. It was well intentioned, but they dropped it. It's rather interesting that they have revived the idea of a primary school, which seems to be working quite well in Dilworth at the moment. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Professor Stone, how would you describe the relationship between James Dilworth and Sir John Logan Campbell? Was it a friendship or a rivalry or something else?
They had little to do with one another, but they seemed to get on quite amicably. They were quite unlike as personalities. Although I've said that Dilworth was not a recluse, he was not shy, but James Logan Campbell was the opposite of being shy. He was very self-confident, as well as he might be. He was so successful in life. But John Logan Campbell, interestingly enough, loved Auckland, but he thought Auckland were quite coarse, cheap and common, because he came from a titled Scottish family.
Yes.
Professor, I wonder what interaction there was between Dilworth and Buckland family, who were very much involved in agriculture and at the end of Market Road in particular in those early days.
Came to this church.
And to this church, yes.
It was evident. It was evident they would have had a close relationship. Anyone who was farming had a close relationship with Bucklands, who were very prominent at the time, and their market business. Yes.
Professor, so of course Newmarket was named as the market because of the farming in the area. So who actually would have owned the market in Newmarket?
Actually, what happened is that this area. What happened was that this area in the eastern suburbs and to a certain extent in the western suburbs was sold as suburban allotments, and it was imagined that they would replicate the situation in England, where you had a market town in the midst of a rural community. Hence the names Epsom itself and Newmarket were actually steals from the English setting. There was no significance in the name itself. It was quite common amongst English settlers, and indeed all European settlers, to rename places that they colonised with their own name. There are, believe it or not, about 10 Berlins in the United States of America. There's even Transylvania, home of Dracula and vampires, so to speak, in there. Now, and one of the most common names was Brighton. You find Brighton all over the world, sometimes as New Brighton. You've got Brightons in Australia as in New Zealand.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think that's all the questions. Good questions there. Wonderful lecture. So please join with me in thanking Professor Stone again. And we're going to have a bit more music now, a bit more music from the string quartet. So I'd like to invite out Einigkeit to come out and perform again. And this time, I think you'll have a